Bronwyn. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. If you have questions while I'm talking, Bronwyn, if you could give me a heads up if there's anything pertinent. Otherwise, I can get to a bunch of them at the end. I'm really excited to be talking to you all today about Venus flytraps. I'm going to start with a little bit of the basic natural history about Venus flytraps, some of which may be familiar to you, some of which may not. Then I'm going to go into my research, which was my PhD research, which was largely about the pollination ecology of Venus flytrap, but also a little bit was a status survey of the species because it's currently under review for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So that was part of my research. And some other fun stuff. And I'm really glad to be speaking to you before Halloween because I think this is the most appropriate Halloween plant. So as you already know, pollination is essential. Strictly speaking, pollination is the transfer of pollen, the sort of male gametophyte from the male part of the flower to the stigma or the female part of the flower. It's an essential strategy for sexual reproduction, which then engenders genetic diversity, being locally adapted, all that stuff. And about 88%, most flowers are pollinated by animals. So bees, butterflies, flies, monkeys, all the rest. Despite how important pollination is, the pollination ecology of many rare plants is not known. And this is concerning because plant pollinator interactions can be disrupted in small or fragmented or low density plant populations like we could observe for many rare plants. And poor pollination is of conservation concern because it can lead to inbreeding depression or low or no reproductive output. So it's concerning that it's understudied in rare plants. An example I have here is Michaud sumac, which is a coastal plain species, which was recently found by some researchers here, that it has separate male and female individuals, and the female individuals are not getting adequate pollination, and that has conservation ramifications. When we think about rare species and the importance of pollination, it's surprising, I think, that some of our most charismatic and fun to look at plants, our carnivorous plants, are amongst the plants that are understudied in terms of their pollination. So I'm speaking from North Carolina and the perspective of North Carolinian. We have about 31 carnivorous plant species here. I know you have some in Maryland too, including some Drosera species and Sarracenia purpurea and probably many more. But of those species, we don't know a lot about their pollination. So of the two general taxa that you see here, we don't even know still who pollinates bladderworts or butterworts. We know that bees and flies visit pitcher plants and flies visit sundews, but we don't know how important pollination is to their reproduction. And most surprising of all, we've only just recently begun to understand the pollination ecology of Venus flytrap. And when you consider that from a conservation perspective, some 18 of our 31 carnivorous plant species here in North Carolina are listed either at the state or federal level. So I just have one example there of a federally endangered species, which is the green pitcher plant. But moving on to the star of the hour is Venus flytrap, Dionaea muscipula. It's also known as meadow clam, tippity witchet, all these other names, but I wouldn't recommend using those names if you don't want to get weird looks. Venus flytrap is fine. One of my favorite anecdotes about the history of this plant was that when it was described to European science in 1768, the person who described it, John Ellis, wrote to Carl Linnaeus, the famous taxonomist, and said, hey, I've got a carnivorous plant here. And Linnaeus said that wouldn't be possible because such a thing would be against the order of nature as willed by God. So we thought that was not possible. It's perennial, it's long-lived. Captive individuals live for about 20 years, and ones in the wild are thought to live for about the same. I know that the usual cultural touchstone for Venus flytraps in movies is Little Shop of Horrors, but my favorite actually is that it was in the movie Nosferatu, which celebrated its 100th birthday this year. And as far as I know, the movie Nosferatu has the oldest footage of Venus flytrap that exists, so happy Halloween. Venus flytrap is the only terrestrial snap trap. So what we mean by that is that it's the only plant growing on land that has the snap trap mechanism. So if you look at the trap itself, each side, each lobe of the leaf has 3, sometimes more trigger hairs. And if one of those trigger hairs is touched, one of them twice or 2, within about 10 seconds, 20 seconds, it'll snap shut and catch what it has. I specify terrestrial because the closest relative of Venus flytrap is called water wheel, and it is an aquatic snap trap that occurs pretty much around the world, but is still quite rare. But you can see the similarities between the two. And then I also include another relative of Venus flytrap, Drosera. Sundews are in the same family. And it's thought that the current morphology of Venus flytrap probably developed from a sundew-like ancestor, where the trigger hairs and the marginal teeth were probably those glandular hairs that we see on sundew. That's the current thinking. The leaf itself on Venus flytrap is the trap. So interchangeably, I might say leaf or trap during this presentation. The actual leaf-looking like part of the Venus flytrap is the petiole, so the stem of the leaf itself. And then if we uproot a Venus flytrap, which I don't recommend, they have a short underground rhizome, which persists when they experience a fire event. And they have variable amounts of red in the leaves, anthocyanins, like many carnivorous plants do, both within the same individual and across different individuals. The floral anatomy, which gets a lot less attention when it comes to this plant. So you can see that the inflorescence or group of flowers there is suspended a good ways distance above the traps, about 6 to 10 inches. And then I think the flowers are beautiful. I've heard them described as understated, but 5 petals, big pollen. There's about between 2 to 22, but usually about 11 of those flowers per inflorescence or group of flowers. And each individual produces 1, rarely 2 inflorescences per season. Flytrap is kind of a misnomer. So they rarely catch flies in the wild. Their diet is mostly ground crawling insects and arthropods like spiders, ants, and beetles, though they're not picky if anything else lands in there. The picture I have here is one with a wasp inside. I've also seen them catch a honeybee, but if you're talking pure numbers in the wild, they're mostly catching things that are crawling along the ground. So I've talked a little bit about the trapping, and that's what gets the most attention. There are hundreds of papers on the trapping mechanism done in a lab setting. The electromechanics and chemistry of how it closes and digests, and that has seems to have ramifications for electrical engineering and robotics. But surprisingly, considering how famous this plant is, little is known about its ecology in the wild. And this is concerning given our talk about rare plants, because Flytrap has a very restricted range. Natively, it only occurs in Southeast North Carolina and a little bit of Northeast South Carolina. And the red, orange, and yellow counties that you see here are ones where it's presumed to be extinct or extirpated. So the range that was already small has restricted a little bit since European colonization. As to the notion of them being in New Jersey, yes, it's thought that carnivorous plant enthusiasts have introduced them to some areas of the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. They've been confirmed introduced to the Apalachicola region of Florida and potentially Washington. But my understanding is that the New Jersey folks are really tight-lipped about it. So it's been a while since it was confirmed. So it can occur outside this range, but natively, this is where it's from. Venus flytrap is considered threatened in the wild. It's listed threatened by the state of North Carolina, and it's currently smack in the middle of review for federal listing, hopefully with a decision within the next year. Some of the main threats are fire suppression. It depends on frequent fire, like many other plants in this ecosystem. Land conversion, this is an area of active development, and I love using this picture to demonstrate that with that billboard that says Oceanfront Family Fun. And this site where there were previously 1,000 flytraps, but at the time of this survey, there are only about 100 from some vehicle coming through there. And to a lesser but not insignificant degree, poaching. Venus flytrap occurs in what we might call savanna pocosin ecotones, and that just means the sort of middling range between usually longleaf pine savannas and a sort of evergreen shrub bog that we refer to as pocosin, which I believe is an Algonquin word meaning swamp on a hill. It's very wet, filled with lots of heaths. And they also, especially in South Carolina, occur on what we call Carolina Bay rims. Those are those elliptical depressions that occur all over the mid-Atlantic East Coast. I have a little sign there to indicate that they're called Maryland Basins in Maryland, and I think they're called Delmarva Bays in the Delmarva region. So they're called different things depending on where you are. But basically they're wet depressions that occur all over the place. Flytrap requires lots of light. It grows in wet, nutrient-poor soil. It likes its feet wet, which is conducive to the evolution of carnivory. So if your soil is poor, you might as well catch your nutrients from the air. And what's interesting is that carnivory has evolved independently about 6 times. So all carnivorous plants aren't related. It's a strategy that seems to develop in areas with a lot of light and nutrient-poor soil. And Venus flytrap, as I mentioned, co-occurs with a lot of other carnivorous plants and many rare plants that occur in the savanna pocosin ecotone. I mentioned poaching, so I just wanted to point out that, poaching is an important threat to Venus flytrap. It doesn't occur very often these days, but when it does, it can clear out a population. Several systemic factors can motivate illegal collection, and we don't know a lot about those systemic factors, but they include things like poverty or drug abuse and other systemic factors that are involved with these sorts of things. It is a Class H felony to poach flytrap in North Carolina with associated fines and jail time. Other threats include changes in hydrology. So when I did my survey work in 2019, there was a drought and most of the flytraps during that time went dormant. And there was also an area that had experienced prolonged drought, and it was having an impact on the flytrap in the area, which, as I mentioned, likes having its feet wet. Recreational off-roading, going off-road with your ATVs, has also to some degree flattened some areas of Venus flytrap, made it non-conducive to them growing. So those are some other minor threats. So I've talked a lot about the natural history and what we do know, and something that we've only just recently learned is what actually pollinates or visits Venus flytrap flowers. So this was work done shortly before I came to NC State, where they went around, caught different insect visitors to Venus flytrap to find out who was actually pollinating it, because we didn't know. And it's chiefly sweat bees, little green sweat bees, and a whole suite of charismatic looking beetles from all sorts of different families. Based on abundance and the proportion of them that actually carry Venus flytrap pollen, these are probably the most important pollinators. And in the study, they also examined who was visiting the trap to figure out whether Venus flytrap ever eats its own pollinators. And up the top there is the suite of different insects that were observed visiting the flowers. And at the bottom are the insects observed in the traps. And highlighted in the middle there is the overlap between those two, and it's pretty small. So among those are buckeye butterflies, certain other butterflies, some spiders. But overall, it's a really small overlap between who's visiting the flowers and who is visiting the traps. And the flower visitors that end up in the traps are usually not the chief pollinators of Venus flytrap. So Venus flytrap appears to be very good at not eating its own friends. So from that study is when I was brought on to answer some lingering questions about Venus flytrap pollination. So chiefly, how important is pollination to its reproductive success? How does pollination success vary between different habitat conditions? And we know that it doesn't like to eat its own pollinators, or doesn't tend to. And is that a result of adaptive pressure to not eat its own pollinators? So I'll sort of work through these one by one. There'll be some graphs incoming. Make sure that if you have any questions for me to go back to later, that you just take note of that. I wanted to acknowledge first off the coast of Northeast Carolina is the ancestral land of multiple indigenous groups. So the work I did specifically took place on the lands of the Chicor and Shikori Coharie, Cori, and Wakamasuan people, and the story of indigenous stewardship on the land is very much entwined with Venus flytrap conservation. So as I mentioned, Venus flytrap requires fire, which prevents encroachment from other light competitors. It promotes flytrap seedling establishment and flowering. And we also know that it maintains bee abundance and diversity. So I was interested to know, how does the time since the last burn influence the morphology, the flower visitor community, and the pollination success of Venus flytrap? So the way that I looked at was we selected 8 sites of differing amounts of time since the last controlled burn had occurred, ranging from a month to nearly 3 years after the last burn. We selected 20 plants from each of those 8 sites. And then for one flower on each of those plants, we allowed it to be pollinated naturally. And on another one, we saturated the stigma with as much pollen as we could to represent sort of the best case scenario for pollination. And essentially, this is a measure of pollen limitation, where we are comparing how well the pollinators are performing compared to what might be the best case scenario, to compare it between these different environments. We also recorded certain plant traits to see how plants were doing in these different sites with different amounts of time since the last burn, including the number of flowers, the height between the flowers and the traps, the number of traps. I won't get into this too much, so I probably should have taken this out because it's a lot of words, but we also recorded site-specific traits like the area that the flytraps were observed blooming, the density of individuals, how the density of the individuals relates to other flowering individuals. And we also collected floral visitors to make some inferences about differences in pollinator communities of flytraps between these different sites. In terms of morphology, so I'm just going over the highlights here so I don't overwhelm y'all with graphs. Something interesting we found, but not necessarily surprising, was that the number of traps or leaves per individual decreased with increasing time since last burn. So a recent plants where a burn had recently occurred had more leaves compared to those where it has been a long time since a burn has occurred, which we might expect given that there's less light when it's been a long time since the last burn. It's more overgrown. Perhaps there's less resources to put into making new leaves. We also observed that hand pollination did increase seed set by about 8%. So we outperformed the pollinators overall at these sites, which means that reproduction in this plant is at least partially limited by the quality and quantity of pollen that's actually getting to them, which is a bit concerning. It could mean that a conservation scheme should consider factors that conserve pollinators in order to maximize the number of seeds set per fruit. And we also found that the number of pollinator species was highest in sites of intermediate time since last burn, which is not necessarily unexpected. What we didn't expect was that the actual identity of this community was not necessarily significantly different between these sites. So most species in those intermediate burn sites, but it wasn't a radically different set of individuals. So our takeaways from this burn history chapter or topic was we observed the number of traps decrease as we go away from a burn. We observed a spike in richness after an intermediate amount of time of that pollinator community, but nothing particularly dramatic. And we found that Venus flytrap can exhibit what we call pollen limitation, which means its reproductive success is limited by its pollinators. But we didn't observe a difference in magnitude of that pollen limitation between sites of varying burn history, which was interesting. We expected those that had been a long time since the last burn to have the porous pollination, but that's not what we observed. Okay, so that might have been a lot of information, but I'm going to move on to a second overarching topic here, which is the notion of pollen versus prey limitation. As I mentioned, for carnivorous plants, insects are considered both friends and food. This is a concept called pollinator-prey conflict, which has been observed in other carnivorous plant species. And there's limited evidence for the notion of pollinator-prey conflict To confirm that pollinator-prey conflict is actually happening, we need to first confirm, one, that there is overlap between the insects visiting the flowers versus those being caught in the traps, plus a cost associated to eating your friends. One might consider that, sure, maybe you catch one of your pollinators every once in a while, but then you're still getting a good meal and you're still able to provision your seeds. So it's not necessarily, cut and dry that it's a bad thing to eat your own pollinators, or it might not happen at a high enough frequency for it to even matter. So when we consider this for Venus flytrap, which we know is very good at not eating its own pollinators, one might look at that height difference between the flowers and the traps and say, of course it's not eating its own pollinators. Look at how far it keeps its flowers away from its traps. And that makes sense. But if you consider the fact that for flowering plants in general, it's a good idea to have your flowers up high and in the path of flying insects, we're not actually sure to what degree that height difference is due to evolutionary pressure to keep your pollinators separate from your prey versus when you're a flowering plant, it's a good idea to have your flowers up high. So to get into those sorts of questions, we asked a few different sub-questions. We wanted to know, is reproductive success more limited by the amount of pollen or the amount of prey that you receive? Also, we wanted to know whether Venus flytrap is capable of pollinating itself. If you don't need a pollinator to get your pollen from point A to point B, then it's a moot point whether eating your own pollinators is a concern. And finally, what are the most effective pollinators of Venus flytrap? If you are catching your pollinators occasionally, but they're not your most valuable players, then maybe it's not a big deal. So those are three separate questions, which I'll try to delineate clearly. But the first one is maybe the most fun, was to find out to what degree reproduction is limited by pollen versus prey. So to do this, I had two different trials where I went out into the fields and selected 80 plants, and 20 of them were supplemented with prey, in this case, frozen crickets, where I'd put a cricket in and sort of gently massage the traps for up to a minute to convince them that it was food. A subset got supplemental pollen. A lucky subset got both prey and pollen, and then an unfortunate 20 of them got nothing. And then after a growing season or after a flowering season, I compared the seed set per fruit between all these different treatments. And I actually did two different treatments, one where I fed them in 2019 and then looked at their reproductive success the following year in 2020, and one where I fed them in 2020 and compared their reproductive success that year, essentially to see whether or not getting supplemental prey within the same growing season after you've started flowers or in the previous growing season when you're prepping for the next season is more important. Self-compatibility, as I mentioned, to determine whether they can pollinate themselves. Essentially, we just pollinated a flower on a number of plants from different sources, either from another individual, from the same flower, from another flower on the same plant, or left unpollinated, and compared the seed set between all these different treatments. And then finally, determining who the most valuable player is. This was the most tedious, perhaps, of the different studies. The way that we did this was that we would put the buds in a organza bag, essentially those little mesh bags you get as treats or gift bags from weddings. We waited for them to flower. We took the bags off. We waited for someone to visit. And then we collected the stigmas and see how many pollen grains that visitor deposited and compared them between the different insects. And when I talk about pollen grains, by the way, this is what they look like for Venus flytrap. Each each grain is actually combined into what's called a tetrad. So a tetrad has 4 different grains stuck together, and Venus flytrap pollen grains are huge. I think they look like Mo capture ping pong balls that you see on motion capture actors. And they're distinctive for the family. So sundews and water wheel also have this weird pollen style. So unusually, this is a graph where the y-axis there is the seed set for fruit, and the x-axis is our different feeding or pollination trials for the pollen versus prey supplementation experiment. Left is 2019 trial, right is 2020 trial, and there's no significant differences between any of the bars here. So we didn't observe a difference in reproductive success between adding on a per fruit basis between adding pollen or prey, or neither or both. What we did observe was that plants that were fed in spring 2020 produced 1.9 more flowers per individual compared to unfed plants, which may not sound like a lot more flowers, but when you consider that an individual produces about 11 flowers per season, that's potentially some 40 more seeds produced per season. So it was interesting that if you give them more prey within the same growing season, they very quickly expound on that to produce more flowers. We found that when you pollinate, again, that y-axis is seed set per fruit, the x-axis is our different versions of pollen treatment. We found that those that were outcrossed, so given pollen from a different individual, produced about the same number of seeds as those that received pollen from another flower on the same individual. So that means that it does accept pollen from itself. However, when you look at the seed set per fruit from unpollinated or those within the same flower, it's much less to nothing. So they still need a mobile vector, i.e. a pollinator, to get pollen from point A to point B. Some flowers, some plants are capable of essentially, as a last-ditch effort, self-pollinating it without the presence of a pollinator. Venus flytrap is not capable of doing it. And then this is a graph demonstrating the performance of our different insect taxa. Unfortunately, we were very near an apiary during the study, so we got a lot of honeybees, which is a non-native bee. And unusually, we found that honeybees outperformed sweat bees, which is one of our more frequent visitors. So honeybees deposited more grains on the stigma per visit compared to sweat bees. And I would not say that this is a recommendation to go out and plant and put honeybee hives near fly traps. My feeling about this is that honeybees are much bigger, and when I was observing them, I noticed that sweat bees rarely touched the female parts at the same time as they were collecting pollen. So even though they're frequent visitors, and even though they frequently carry flytrap pollen, they may not necessarily be the most important visitors in terms of reproductive success. So we need to do more collections there to see who's actually affecting the most. And for example, we didn't observe any beetle visits on our experimental plants during this study, despite how important they've been observed to be previously. I observed them going to other plants that didn't have the wetting treat bag treatment, so that they didn't count. But I'd be interested to know if beetles, because they're larger and clumsier, are maybe actually affecting most of the pollination for this plant. So in summary for that, we noticed that flower production was boosted by prey capture, that 1.9 more flowers per individual. Venus flytrap is self-compatible. It produces seeds when pollinated with its own pollen, but it still needs someone to get that from pollen from A to B. And even though sweat bees are frequent visitors, other visitors may have an outsized role based on body size. Okay, I'm going to press forward. This is the last subject to talk about. So in 2019 and 2020, the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, which is kind of our equivalent of the Department of Natural Resources, led a status survey of flytrap populations. The last status survey for the species was done 20 years ago. It was petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act in 2016, but we don't know a lot about literally how many there were. At the time of 2018, it was estimated that there were 73,000 to 158,000 flytraps in the wild, but it was largely unknown. So I was brought on board to help with a multi-agency collaborative effort in order to literally count them and take into account how many populations there are. The goals were to survey and map as many wild populations as possible, record extant threats at those sites, and record evidence of Venus flytrap cutworm. Now, what is that? I'll get to that later. So we did a mixture of literal comprehensive counts, going around, walking back and forth, counting all of them, and also subsample counts. And we did it on both public and private property, as much as we were able to do in 2019 and 2020. So we counted over 800,000 during the survey. And when we take into account those populations we weren't able to visit, there's about 880,000 Venus flytraps in the wild in North and South Carolina. So that might sound like a lot. It's worth pointing out that most Venus flytrap populations are very small. So of that 880,000, only 12 populations have 2,000 or more individuals, and most of them are very small, so less than 500 individuals sort of scattered around. And the vast majority of 880,000 is in just a few mega populations. And 3 populations comprise 67% of wild flytraps. The way I heard someone put it is that we might have a lot of eggs, but they're in a very few baskets. So I'll get to the Venus flytrap cutworm. This plant has a much rare specialist herbivore that almost exclusively eats Venus flytrap. It's thought to switch to a different host at a later stage, but this is an extremely rare species. As of now, only 50 have been knowingly observed since about the 1850s. Extremely rare, so we wanted to survey at the same time. So the way we did this was we had light traps to capture the adult moths, and also while we were doing the survey work, looking out for signs of feeding and frass, which is insect poop, on the plants themselves. I'm not sure if you're able to see the actual signs of chewing on this plant on the right, but there they are. And so during the course of the survey, we found 9 individuals, and I observed 11 more this year. So 20 individuals have been spotted since 2019. And I like to point it out, I like to spend some time with this species, with this audience specifically, because there is supposedly a population of this species in Maryland that feeds on sundew. It's been, I think, a decade or so since it has last been seen, and I would love to get up there or maybe encourage people who are out there with sundews to keep an eye out for this species. Happy to talk more about it. And I also like to point out this species because this moth depends on Venus flytrap, which in turn depends on fire. So it suffers from many of the same threats that Venus flytrap does. However, unlike Venus flytrap, it does not survive a fire directly. It depends on a patchy fire strategy in order to recolonize areas that have been burned. So the fire strategies that work for plants aren't necessarily always perfect for insects. So I point this out in conjunction with pollinators just to point out that insect responses to fire and fire management are different and should be considered as part of a holistic management scheme. This is a brief overview of all the stuff about the burn history, the notion that the number of traps decrease between our burns, and that Venus flytrap is pollen limited in terms of its reproduction. We found that flower production was limited by prey, not necessarily reproduction during this, not necessarily seed set per fruit during this study. It's self-compatible. Sweat bees were knocked out of the park by honeybees, and potentially means we need to do more work there. And in terms of the status survey, as I mentioned, lots of eggs, just a few baskets. With that, I would like to thank my funders and all the many, many people that helped me in the field. And I want to say thank you for listening to all that, and happy Halloween.
Well, thank you, Laurie. This was amazing. My head is spinning and I have so many questions, and I think other people do as well. Why don't we unshare and come back together? And let me go back here. We have a couple. Brittany asked, how long does a Venus flytrap stay dormant or can stay dormant?
That's a great question. And actually, we don't know how long a Venus flytrap can stay dormant. There was a study recently where an environment that had some 10 or so years since the last burn and was completely overgrown, experienced a burn, and all of a sudden flytraps came up. And it was thought that they'd been dormant during that time. So it's important that we know how long they can stay dormant, because maybe we can recover some of these fire suppressed populations. Short answer, we don't know.
Let's see, Vashti asked how long do they live? And I thought that you said they would live up to 20 years, but can you confirm that for me?
Yeah, that's right. It's thought to be up to 20 years. We're not positive what it is in the wild, but probably similarly long-lived, since I've been following the same individuals for about 5 years now.
I know.
And we have, do the flowers and or traps have an odor or perfume?
That's a great question. We know the traps have an odor. A study was done in 2016 or 2017 by a group out in Germany, where they collected the odors from the traps that have similar properties to the smells of fruits and flowers, so potentially have a prey attractive quality. If you stick your own nose in a flytrap trap, you won't be able to smell it. I tried to collect the smell of the flowers to see if they were comparable, but that was inconclusive. So I think someone with enough funds and the right equipment needs to definitely figure out what they smell like, for sure.
Karen wants to know, did you get into the green swamp in North Carolina?
Great question. Green Swamp is one of the places that's very open about the fact that they have fly traps, and they are one of those mega populations that I mentioned. They have about 300,000 of them. But me personally, I did not survey there. There's a group of dedicated individuals there that survey there every year, and we used their data.
Let's see, Turk says, are there mammals which consume the flower and or leaves?
We know that deer sometimes graze on the flowers. I haven't observed it much myself, but there was a population in South Carolina where it appears a deer went through and clipped a bunch of the flower heads, so it does happen.
What about how the trigger hairs and digestion? Can you go a little bit on that?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the lobes of a Venus flytrap, they're sort of shaped like that, sort of outwardly convex. Each one has 3 or so trigger hairs. And when one of those is touched within a certain amount of time, it differs depending on the temperature. There is both changes in water pressure and also electrical signaling, like similar to how we get transmit nerve signals from our brain to our fingers that actually signals the trap to snap shut. And it'll sort of snap shut with little openings between those marginal hairs at first. And if the prey inside continues to struggle and continues to activate those trigger hairs, it will, I like to call it, commit to actually eating it. And the process of digestion takes about anywhere from 4 to 10 days. Then where it consumes the soft parts, mostly potassium and nitrates, reopens, and the undigested crunchy parts are re-released. And that's a very short summary of hundreds of papers. I can just go ahead and go off these questions, Bronwyn, that are in the chat if you'd like.
Sure, go ahead.
Jillian asked if there could be night pollinators for these white flowers, and could they emit a fragrance at night? Interestingly, during my first year, we did put out game cameras to see who was visiting them at night, and we noticed a lot of firefly visits, which made us very excited. So we went out there at night with headlamps on and noticed that the fireflies were landing on our heads, and they were actually attracted to the red lights that we were using for the game cameras. Other than that, it doesn't seem like anything significant is visiting them at night. As to whether there's difference in the smell at night, that would be interesting to measure from the day versus the evening. But as far as we know, it's the day pollinators that are doing the brunt of the work pollinating Venus flytrap.
Do we have any other questions? Climate change.
So yes, climate change is a consideration for this plant. I will say that it's been sort of the last thing to be discussed by the agencies I worked with. It seems to be a lower consideration, but you might consider that those populations that are near the coast might be affected more by saltwater inundation or changes in the frequency and intensity of hurricanes in the coming years. Personally, I'm concerned about the frequency and intensity of drought because they do go dormant during drought conditions, and potentially that could have an effect on their reproduction and long-term survival. So definitely more work needs to be done there.
I have a question. Have there been any fossil records of Venus flytraps that you know of? And was the extent of the wild populations ever measured in other parts of the world? Or has it always just been in that little area?
It'd be so interesting to do like pollen core samples and see the evolutionary fate of sundews over time. But as far as we know, Venus flytraps have only ever existed in this area. And in fact, there's a group at UNC in collaboration with the North Carolina Botanical Gardens that have been doing genetic work to understand the dispersal of this species over time. But actually, a lot of species in this little pocket of North and South Carolina are endemic to that region. And it's in part because over geologic time, there have been times when the ocean levels have been raised with pockets of upland, which has allowed some of these plants to evolve. So it's a really interesting little pocket of endemism in this part of North and South Carolina.
And there was one other thing that, I mean, for me, you meant, what is the fruit of the Venus flytrap, or the seed? Where does that get dispersed, or?
Yeah, so the seed, I should have shown a picture of it. It resembles a little green ball about the size of, oh, I don't know, half a raisin or maybe a garbanzo bean, smaller than that. And then when it dries out or dehisces, it exposes about 20 to 40 little black seeds, about the size of sesame seeds or poppy seeds. And the seeds don't seem to go far from the mother plant. They appear to be dispersed on a limited basis by falling rain, falling near the plant. They don't seem to go far. There's a group at Duke that is studying the demography of this plant, and hopefully we'll be able to know more about how the life history and how it actually works that way. I see a question in the chat about indigenous peoples and their uses for the trap. I have looked into this, and perhaps there's more information out there that I haven't seen. The only thing I've seen was anecdotal information reported by settlers of the traps themselves being used as fish bait, I guess because they're brightly colored, interestingly shaped. I can imagine that they might actually be useful as fish bait, but that's the only thing that I know of. And how did I get interested in studying Venus flytraps? I didn't set out to study Venus flytraps. I was interested in plant-insect interactions. But when I interviewed with the lab that I did my work with, they were doing work with Venus flytraps and asked me if I wanted to get involved with that. So I was very happy to get into flytraps. You can stop me whenever I need to stop answering questions, but I'll keep going otherwise.
Keep going.
Okay, Karen asks, I see these sold at stores. How hard are they to successfully grow? The main thing that people say to me when I say I study Venus flytrap is they say, I used to have one of those, but I killed it. And I think not knowing that they are native to North and South Carolina is a lot of why a lot of flytraps end up dead. People think they're tropical and therefore grow under a canopy, but actually they, with a little bit of effort, they're pretty straightforward to grow. They like 8 hours of direct sunlight. They like to stand in water, have their feet wet, and people seem to have more success using filtered or distilled water so that there's not a buildup of minerals. And earlier, someone, I think Doris, said that they're growing Flytraps, so maybe you can ask them for advice.
Has I mean, you mentioned that you went onto private property to do some of your looking for them for the cataloging. How receptive were the people, the private property owners, of letting you onto the property? I assume that you couldn't get onto every property that you wanted to, and what were some of those issues?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that was further hindered by the fact that that occurred in 2020. So we were delayed in actually contacting landowners because of all the restrictions. And we found, I think in general, that the people who were willing to let us onto their property, which was not many, I think it was something like 16 separate landowners, including some golf courses. Of those that let us onto their property, they were in general enthused about the notion of preserving the flytraps they had on their property, provided that the government didn't bother them too much. So some people were very enthusiastic about and proud of the fact that they have flytraps. And there's an effort by a group here in North Carolina that's multi-agency called Venus Flytrap Champions, which is hoping to give recognition to private landowners who are making efforts to conserve their flytraps and give them resources for how to burn or otherwise manage their land. So that's been an interesting aspect.
Oh, I love that. And so, and that kind of goes on, are there any more efforts to capitalize on the Venus flytraps as being so unique and in the wild in North Carolina as an ecotourism and a source of revenue, so that folks can see that as more of a benefit?
That's a great point. I think from the researcher and manager perspective, people are generally nervous to tell the locations of these plants because of the poaching risk. But there are some sites that are open about the fact that they have them, like the Stanley Reader Garden, which I think you visited, and Green Swamp, where people can get a chance to actually get out and learn about the importance of these ecosystems and get a sense of their natural heritage. I think Venus flytrap is potentially a good flagship plant for teaching about this environment and the importance of fire. And we'll see if the listing happens, that will definitely skyrocket interest in conserving this ecosystem. So yeah, I mean, it definitely has potential as an outreach and an education plant.
Are you worried that if it gets listed, people will just go into their property and just start tearing them up and running them over?
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit. If they don't want the federal government, but the federal government has no say when it comes to plants over what people do on private property. So if we educate that they shouldn't be worried about being messed with, then hopefully that can be circumvented.
Let's see, Jillian asked, what about reintroduction to some areas?
Yeah, I haven't heard that discussed too much, but as we saw, Venus flytrap readily takes sometimes to being planted in areas. So I'm not aware of any efforts to reintroduce it actively, mostly just to conserve where it already exists. But that's a great point. Maybe that's something that could be levied with the Venus Flytrap Champions organization as a potential avenue.
And of course, with these presentations, I love that we just don't know everything. We don't know a lot. We're still looking and trying to figure out the answers. And so there's a lot of work to be done in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to put my email in the chat if anyone has any follow-up questions.
Let's see, we have one more. How feasible is captive production for taking pressure off of native population?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think a geneticist would probably be able to speak to that more, because we are interested, it's not just about the number of individuals we have in the wild, it's also about the genetic diversity of the individuals that exist in the wild, and the fact that the wild individuals may be locally adapted to where they're growing. So I think a captive program is maybe considered a last resort option for this, but that we know they grow readily in captivity and can even be vegetatively propagated. So, I mean, it's something that could be on the back burner for sure.
Last chance, everyone. Get your question in. All right, all the kudos are flying in, Laurie, and I want to add mine as well. That was wonderful. This was a great understanding of Venus flytraps and all of the questions that you're trying to answer. And thank you for all the research that you're doing to help us better understand our natural world. We appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much for having me. This was really cool.
All right, and everybody, thanks for joining us. I hope to see you at one of our next Must Learn Thursdays, and also the big book sale. Those are used books. Is anybody confused that those are not? Those are used books that are donated to us that we get to sell as a fundraiser. So if you do have any books that you'd like to donate for the sale, let us know, and we'll add them to the mix. We had a question about that earlier. So stay well, stay curious, stay outside, enjoy this fall foliage, and get to North Carolina to see some Venus flytraps in the wild. Make a plan. Take care. Good night, everybody.